As businesses, you want to be successful. So you want to set up patterns that lead to desired outcomes. So an example that comes up a fair bit is like what to do with a free trial, right? At the end of a free trial, does it immediately upgrade to a paid plan or does it immediately cancel? General UX would say if you put friction in front of a user, they're much more likely to fall out, even if they don't necessarily want to. But at the same time, we've all known that when we've had to set reminders to ourselves to cancel something. So walk us through a little bit, I guess, though, how to have the right kinds of ethical conversations and what sort of things we should be discussing and considering when we're talking about these different behavioral patterns.
Ethics is a part of this that's really important, and we shouldn't force them into a choice in a way that's sort of hidden or obtuse.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Modern Web Podcast here at All Things Open in Raleigh, North Carolina. My name is Rob Ocel. I'm the VP of Innovation at This.Labs. Joined in this podcast by my co-host, Tracy Lee. Tracy, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. And as has been kind of a theme, we have another local dev.
Yeah.
The local dev scene really turning out here at All Things Open. Joining us today, we have Bermon Painter, who's the Composable Platforms Leader at Slalom. We're here to talk about, what you're here to talk about, which is kind of this interesting idea about behavioral economics and UX and kind of patterns and things of that nature. I guess to kind of get us started, can you kind of define, I guess, what that behavioral economics is and maybe differentiate it from things like, social psychology or pop science or, things of that nature? Like, what is behavioral economics kind of as a discipline?
Yeah, really good question. Behavioral economics is interesting because it essentially combines a bit of psychology and a bit of economics together to do ethical manipulation is, I guess, the best way to frame what that is.
Sure.
The purpose of it is to understand the biases that impact the way people make decisions, design interventions to help sort of overcome or influence those biases, and then give them a sense of choice that has a net positive economic impact to their life. So part of it is making sure that we're not unethically manipulating people. We're always trying to give them a choice, ideally pushing them down pathways or what we call choice architectures, so that they make more informed choices that benefit them.
Oh my God.
Can you give people an example where they might not even be realizing that they're being nudged or influenced?
Yeah. So a good example, it's election season. When we think of choice architectures and applying behavioral economics, the goal as a country should be that as many people that should be able to vote. We should make that an easy choice for them. From a policy level, we make it difficult. Voting is an opt-in. So if we were to apply behavioral economics to voting policy, a voting registration policy, we would design that in a way where it's an opt-in or opt-out versus an opt-in. That way you're automatically signed up or enrolled to be a voter when you turn 18. That way that everybody has the chance to vote, should they choose to do so, and hopefully they do.
Yeah, so I mean, talk through, I guess, a little bit, that opt-in, opt-out one. That's one that's been talked about a lot, right? There's been a lot of discussions about whether certain things should be opt-in by default or opt-out by default. How do you lead a conversation around that, like using kind of the frameworks that you're talking about? Like, where is this conversation happening, I suppose, where you're sort of maybe bringing in some of the concepts to explain why one choice versus the other might have certain impacts versus others?
Yeah, really good lead in. Let's use a life sciences example. I think that's one that's meaningful. So let's talk about continuous glucose monitors. We have quite a number of people in the US that are type 1, type 2 diabetics. And it is in their best interest, both from a health standpoint and from an economic standpoint, to manage their health in good ways, ideal ways, so that they spend less on healthcare, they live longer, they have healthier lifestyles. So they have, as individuals, typically biases that impact how they make decisions. It could be decisions around how much they exercise, do they exercise, decisions around the types of food that they eat, decisions around how they engage with their healthcare provider. Some of those decisions are not in their best interest because we're people and we have opinions, and sometimes we make decisions that are not in our best interest. So that there are a few things that we can do in that scenario. So most diabetics will have a continuous glucose monitor. Most of the products that exist from like a mobile application standpoint or a tablet standpoint, you're basically just getting the glucose data. So you know what's going on, and you know throughout the day when your sugar is spiking or sort of in a trough. But we don't get a lot of really good why data, like what triggered the drop or the spike. We also don't get a lot of information that can help influence behaviors. So what we can do in those scenarios is we can start to understand the biases. Why does this individual, these groupings of people make decisions in the way that they do? And then how do we design interventions to influence specific behaviors? It could be behaviors that we know from the data that they have a spike every day at 10 a.m. Where their glucose is elevated. So what's causing that? Can we map that with health data, diet data, to figure out, is there something that they're doing in their daily lives that's triggering a spike or decline?
Well, the apps do prompt you to enter that information.
They do.
It's just a question of entering it, which I think is the hardest part, getting a user to actually do something that is in their best interest.
It is. It's like it takes time. And not everybody is going to manually finger in, okay, I had a bowl of oatmeal that had all of this stuff in it, or I exercised for 30 minutes, and this was my heart rate and all the other data associated to it. Like it's really hard. So what we can start to do is we can start design interventions that essentially nudge them to perform an action. So it could be, you know what, you've been sitting for 3 hours. We notice around this time your levels go up or down. We probably should nudge you to take a 15-minute brisk walk or something like that.
Is there an app that does this?
There are apps.
Okay.
So I use an Apple Watch.
Yes, but not specifically for people with diabetes.
Right. It's very general, right? So the Apple Watches are for everybody. Where we haven't quite gotten to yet from a technology standpoint, even from my applications, it's not very contextual. So if I'm a type 1 or type 2 diabetic, I have general stuff, and there are some specific apps for diabetics, but it all doesn't tie together well.
Apple Watch, let's say.
Yeah, through like an Apple Watch or Android or another like IoT device. The other side of that is there isn't very good data transfer on what I'm collecting, whether I'm using devices or not, and my healthcare provider. So one activity that we've been doing with a GCM provider is essentially building like a behavioral economics focused application, both for practitioners or providers and for the patients, so that the data is connected and it ties into the GCM. It'll tie into an IoT device. We can map it to other apps if they have them that are sort of in that ecosystem.
It's a new app, one app to manage all the other apps.
That's right. Hyper focused on type 1, type 2 diabetics. And it sits in what we'd call the unregulated space. We're not giving healthcare advice because that means the FDA has to approve everything, and it gets a bit dicey on what we can and can't say. It's more leveraging nudges to influence their behaviors in hopefully a helpful way, so that we can take the data that they have, make it more meaningful. This is kind of where AI starts to come into play, where we can start to make sense of all of the data that are collecting beyond, okay, it's high or low. We can start to recognize trends. We can start to surface those trends and make recommendations based off of where they live, the level of activities they prefer to perform, the types of foods they prefer to eat, and then also provide that information to their providers. So the providers can also be an influence. They can help sort of nudge them from a person-to-person standpoint and actually give the health recommendations on what they should or shouldn't do based off the data that we're giving them.
Okay. And you're talking also about integration into like health systems, right?
That's right. Integrating into Epic and some other odds and ends. Yeah.
I didn't want to bring up the word Epic, but I was thinking it.
How much of the insights that you're getting and that come out of kind of this practice and this thinking universal, how much of it is cultural and how much of it is individual? Like, can you generalize the things that you've learned, or is this a thing that you need to be testing and getting data with every new user base, with every new app, with every new industry?
It's somewhere in the middle. For the type 1, type 2 diabetic example, that is hyper-focused on on those demographics. So it's not as general just because of the way that we're applying the concept. Now, there are general concepts like nudging or designing choice architectures, which is essentially how do you help people navigate the various choices that they have and design the choices in a way that they make the optimal choice for them.
Yeah, it just seems, because what it strikes to me is that, like, we encounter this a lot with international teams, right? Like, people want feedback in different ways. Some people want it very upfront and they want it very direct. Other people want it couched and kind of, and guarded a little bit. And so I guess I would suspect that people might have the same feelings about their apps. They're like, oh, this thing is being way too overbearing on me. Whereas other people are like, no, I want this thing yelling at me if I need to be doing something.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if some of that shows up in data, especially internationally, where certain patterns are really well received with one group of users, but then just roundly rejected by another set.
Yeah, I feel like, at least in the US, we are heavy on the consumerism side. We are nudged in a lot of cases to consume at all costs. Which isn't super healthy. Other countries have a bit more healthy of a consumer mindset.
You just have to optimize. I feel like you optimize for the American. Like there was Shweta, who is a professor over at Kennesaw State. She was talking about an app that they built for people in China to create better, healthier lives. But even the colors, even kind of like the imagery on the apps, and how, Chinese culture is a little bit more, I don't know, ephemeral, I guess, or something, right? Like that's, the user research helped them, kind of like design and optimize towards that.
Well, and another example of this is kind of with the privacy regulations that are going on in Europe. Like, sometimes we have fights on Twitter where Americans are like, if I have to click on another one of these cookie banners, but yet the Europeans are very kind of protective of their data. And if they didn't have access or control over that, then they're going to distrust the service. It's kind of funny, interesting situation for international companies. You got to somehow create a product that is speaking to both audiences at the same time, not even counting the regulatory frameworks that you have to operate within. It's quite a challenge for designers, I have to imagine.
It is. I think, most designers, that they haven't worked on big global experiences, they definitely take a U.S. perspective.
Yeah, right.
Which is not necessarily wrong, but
if you're building for the U.S. market, right? Even just
it makes sense.
POCing, in a U.S. market, what do? You can't optimize for everyone.
No, you really can't. It's getting easier, I think. So there are personalization platforms that have been coming out, plus some of the AI tools. So as an example, this isn't behavioral economics driven, but it is fairly transactional in financial services, where it's a large company. They have, I think, 400,000 locations around the globe, and they're in like 200 countries. So the way that they present their offerings at a country level need to align to the culture and the region and the locale. Otherwise, they're just not going to do well from a business standpoint. So we have to understand those nuances, and what the new personalization platforms allow us to do is we can identify the various segmentations, and then we can do more automation around, okay, we need to show this type of content framed in this way with this type of imagery that aligns to the cultural norms. And then over here, it needs to be this, over there, it needs to be that. So we can automate all of like what we show to people. And then we get to use tools like AWS Bedrock is one that we're using more often. That allows us to do localized content. So technically what we can do now, which we couldn't do 5 or 6 years ago, is if I'm searching for something online or I'm clicking through from a social media campaign, we can automatically generate the page end to end with text, images, calls to actions that are specifically relevant to what the individual is searching for. So we get to increase the relevancy, and we can do that in any language, in any region, as long as we have the data around the localization.
It's amazing. I mean, I just think some of these tools out there, like I'm giving an AI talk here at All Things Open, but one of my last slides is just, look, you think this is hard, but here are all the random AWS services or, the products that Microsoft offers that just plug in and here it is. So it's amazing how far we've come to just make it so easy, right? There's an app for that. There's a tool for that. There's a whatever.
It's getting so much easier. Yeah.
let's talk about the ethical side of this, because I mean, people have heard of the concept of dark patterns. And I think maybe people think that that might be obvious. Like that's just a clearly greedy thing that a company is doing.
Right.
But, you know, we've built products, shipped products. I mean, it is not an easy conversation at the margins because, you know, as businesses, you want to be successful. So you want to set up patterns that lead to desired outcomes. So an example that comes up a fair bit is like what to do with a free trial, right? At the end of a free trial, does it immediately upgrade to a paid plan or does it immediately cancel? Because, you know, general UX would say if you put friction in front of a user, they're much more likely to fall out, even if they don't necessarily want to. They might suddenly realize, oh, that thing I had canceled, I'm not going to bother with it anymore, even if they might have enjoyed it. But at the same time, we've all known that when we've had to set reminders to ourselves to cancel something, that like, why do I have to put in payment information to just try something out? So walk us through a little bit, I guess, though, how to have the right kinds of ethical conversations and what sort of things we should be discussing and considering when we're talking about these different behavioral patterns.
Ethics is a part of this that's really important. You know, like we're doing ethical manipulation in a sense, but we're doing it to serve the individual over the company. We need to help them make the best choices that they can make, both from like a health, physical, financial standpoint. When it comes to making ethical choices and avoiding dark patterns, you know, from a business standpoint, some businesses prefer to just they want to make as much money as they can in as sort of a time frame as they possibly can, and they do that in ways that doesn't benefit their customers. So free trials, right? That's always a fun one to dig into. If we were applying behavioral economics to free trials, bless you. If we were applying behavioral economics to free trials, we would always provide the user with the ability to choose. So they should be able to choose, do I want...
I really like that idea.
Yeah. They should be able to choose, do I want to mash the button to say, yes, I want to move from free trial to paid? That would be the easiest thing to do, to give them the choice so they're not opted into something they didn't agree to opt into. I know it's in the legal paperwork that they're going to flip them over, but that's a policy that the company invented. And the fun thing about policies is we can invent new policies. That benefit the user. At the end of the day, to be ethical, the user always has to be able to make a choice. They have to know what the choices are. And we shouldn't force them into a choice in a way that's sort of hidden or obtuse.
There wasn't an example of something where they had an opt-in, opt-out feature. Okay, fine. And we talk about that in just a second. But like every time you would go to the settings page, it would re-toggle the opt-in. And you had to catch it every time, because if you change something else and hit save, it would then opt you in. And we can maybe all agree that that's on the farthest side of dark pattern. But just aside,
bad development.
Okay, it could have just been a bug. But like but then there's just the idea of whether something to be opt in or opt out, which it really just depends on your perspective. Because again, it really just comes down to, well, what would the user want? Now, if you're a business and you're making an ethical product, you would want to believe that your customers want your new features,
right?
Or want that support, that what you're offering them gives them some value to offset whatever you're asking of them. So, maybe just from that basis, that's not so obvious, but just whether to make something opt in or opt out, you can go back and forth on this. Does it come down to a judgment call primarily? Is there a framework for adding up the pluses and minuses and going, oh, okay, I've formula applied, this is the pattern we should go? Or is it just down to, you listen, I guess, what to the feedback of the customers is and kind of reassess from there how it was perceived?
There's a bit of an ethical framework that you can apply. And it all, again, goes back to, are we hiding choices? Or are we giving the person or the customer the ability to choose?
Sure.
So here's a question.
Yeah.
Is it unethical to follow industry standard best practices?
It could potentially be.
Which industry?
Yeah.
Well, you think about this opt-in, opt-out, right? This example, and it's, I would go, well, okay, fine, but I want to make money too. So what's the industry best practice? Let's follow that. Because if all the SaaS providers are doing one thing, okay, fine, we want to be more ethical, but do we? Define ethical, right? Like, if people expect it and, you're doing good, so maybe you're providing a little bit of a user experience, but does that really change? Like, what are you driving change in the world?
Right.
Or are you just sitting out of potential profit where the customer was already expecting that behavior? What are your thoughts?
At a high level, there are things that businesses do that are sort of the norm. I think we were talking about this before the podcast on just the nature of consulting and kind of what's going on with all of the layoffs that are happening in the tech industry. And there is definitely a common pattern that feels like an industry standard where companies are showing record profits. They lay off a bunch of people.
Yeah.
CEO gets a big old bonus. They do stock buybacks. That's the pattern that we've seen over the last year. It could be considered industry standard now, technically.
Oh.
So just because a bunch of companies are doing it doesn't mean that we should also do it, because that is definitely not good for all of the folks that are getting laid off. There's no reason to lay them off. Really, it's just to drive profits.
Right.
And I think that's the dilemma that we have as designers or as engineers, is there is somebody somewhere higher up in the food chain that's going to ask us to do something. And the thing that they ask us to do is typically going to drive profits. That's typically the end goal. Like, they've got to be making money. But sometimes in the effort to drive profit, they are making either borderline unethical decisions or very clearly unethical decisions.
Where's the line, right? It's like, okay, we need to have profits, but what's the profit versus layoff balance?
Right.
You know, and what is that standard? Or should there be one? Or
yeah, at least in my mind, I kind of draw the line on, will this have a positive or negative economic impact to the customer? So opt-ins or free trials is a good example of that, right? I sign up for a free trial to try something out, not to necessarily transact and give you the business money until I choose to do so. Now, the language and the user experience is weird on some of those free trials, where if I'm not paying attention, the free trial goes to a paid trial. From my standpoint, unless I intended that to happen as a customer, that's a net negative economic impact to me as the customer. So that's where we've crossed the lines. We've produced a negative economic impact to the user because we took away that choice. What should happen is there should be some sort of an opt-in, like, do I want to pay you money? Do I want to move this to a transaction? Where, like, one, I think that builds trust in the company. Like, the worst thing that I feel like I have to do is I sign up for a free trial. I notice that I've been paying for it for 3 months or 6 months, and I've lost $30, $50, couple $100. I will never do business with that company again. So I cancel the trial. So they get short-term gains with long-term losses because they lose trust if they do things that way.
Well, it strikes me that the things that you're saying here are applicable not just to designers. When we talked about how this goes into design, and certainly should be a part of that, I was wondering if you could just make a nudge to the engineers and the leaders out there as to why these should be things that they study and not just, go, oh yeah, that's for the product people. That's not what I have to worry about.
I think from a career standpoint, the more you know, especially adjacent to the role that you have, the more successful of a career you're going to have. Because you become not just good at one thing. Eventually that one thing is going to go away. You need to get better at things that are sort of adjacent to the thing that you're good at. So, for example, if I was a COBOL engineer 20 years ago, you can probably still make pretty good money with the banks because they need some of these older school languages. But if that's the only thing that I know and I've still got 20 years for retirement, I'm not going to be employed in another decade more than likely. So I should probably pick up Java, or I should probably pick up JavaScript, which is sort of eating the world these days. The other side of that is I'm not just working with other engineers. Hopefully you're not working with other engineers just by themselves. You should be working with the strategists and the designers because collectively you should be making decisions together. And the more you know about how to communicate with your peers and other disciplines, the better you're going to be at your job, and vice versa.
This is why he's in the position he is, right? Like, I think this is the whole, this is going from, hey, I'm just an engineer doing my job, to, hey, you know what, if I'm an engineer that actually understands what the business strategy is, then I'm a little bit better. Hey, if I'm an engineering manager that understands what marketing is doing, then I understand how to better communicate what my goals are. hey, if I'm a VP of engineering and I understand what the earnings calls are doing and thinking, or I'm talking to operations or sales, then I can better drive the strategy. So I think that's just overall good general advice.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Worst case scenarios, we're all users, and it's nice to know what people are doing to us. Well,
That's right.
Listen, we're kind of already at the end of our time here. So for people that are interested in learning more about this, because this topic is fascinating, can you let people know where maybe they could find you online if they had any questions or wanted to keep the conversation going?
Sure. I have great SEO. You can search for Berman Painter. It's going to be me, and then maybe like 30 results later, my dad is in there somewhere who is also Berman. So I have better SEO. If you go to my LinkedIn, you can also see an office hours. I do open office hours every Friday morning from 7 to 9 a.m.
Awesome.
Anything that you want to talk about, we'll talk about. Could be resumes, career, interviews. We could talk about behavioral economics. We could talk about root beer, which is my preferred beverage of choice.
Nice.
So anything you want, 15 minutes a pop. That's what we do. They're all free. Glad to meet folks.
Awesome. Well, that is going to be it for us today on this episode of the Modern Web Podcast. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks, of course, to our guest, Burman.
Thank
I would
you.
like to say the conversation does not stop here. Definitely check out all the links that Burman just mentioned there. We'll put it in the show notes as well. As for me, you can find me online at Robocell. As for Tracy, you can find her online at Lady Leet. And as we close out, just like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, for sponsoring this show, who would like me to remind you that they are trusted experts in modern web development and consulting. In today's fast-paced tech world, scaling your development teams and bringing innovative ideas to life can be challenging. That's where This.Labs comes in. We specialize in amplifying your technical capabilities. Whether it's expanding your dev team with seasoned professionals or streamlining your project's journey from ideation to deployment, our approach is personalized and collaborative. We take the time to understand your unique business needs and craft tailored solutions that not only meet but exceed your expectations. With a proven track record of driving innovation and delivering results, we empower businesses to stay ahead of the curve and maximize their ROI. Visit this.co to discover how This.Labs can help transform your vision into reality. Thanks This.for sponsoring this episode and the community.